Today we will discuss one of the most relevant and interesting topics, the economic miracle, thanks to which China became one of the world leaders right in the lifetime of many of us. The term "made in China" has gone from derision to commonplace, but how did it happen? And is it true that China owes its development to the United States? What does Hong Kong have to do with this? Was there such an economic breakthrough at all? We will talk about all this and much more in the next couple of minutes. First, let's go to the end of World War II, which is rarely mentioned, but China suffered terrible losses there, more than 15 million, and by some estimates even 30 million people. This is several times more than the losses of Great Britain, Poland, USA, Italy, Hungary, Austria, and France combined. During this period, the country faced some of the worst war crimes, including the widespread use of chemical weapons, the massacre of entire cities, and secret squads experimenting on Chinese citizens. This topic deserves a separate video. At this time, we just need to remember that the country has suffered a lot. As you know, resentment does not come alone. Almost immediately after the surrender of Japan, a civil war broke out in China between the communists and the Kuomintang government. We have already talked about this in a separate video. It should be noted that until 1950, the Chinese were not given a respite, because after the flight of the Kuomintang government to Taiwan, it was the turn to fight with Tibet. Formally, Tibet was annexed only in 1951, and in the next 2 years there were large-scale purges, as a result of which, according to experts, 2 million people died. The Communist Party took over the administration of the country only after resolving problems with dissidents and partisans in the territory. All this was led by Mao Zedong, under the clear leadership of the USSR. They copied the neighbors' tactics. In 1953, Mao held the first five-year plan, and it is important to understand that at that time China was a completely agrarian country with a very poor population that had experienced almost 20 years of constant wars. There was no talk of a breakthrough, even theoretically. Basically, in the first five-year plan, China made up for what the countries of the West and even the USSR had long since passed. They developed industrialization, built basic factories, and developed industry. A total of 595 factories and other construction projects were built, with about a third of them built with Soviet assistance. On the whole, the first five-year plan was successful and received with enthusiasm by the Chinese. They produced more steel in 5 years than in the previous 50 years. Industrial GDP has doubled. However, do not forget that interest and economic indicators are relative. If you have $1 and they give you another one, your capital increases by 100%, but you don't get richer. The same can be said about the first five-year plan. For the Chinese, tired of devastation, it was a breakthrough, but there was no talk of an economic miracle. Moreover, according to the results of 5 years, agriculture has made almost no progress in development. Remember this fact, because we will return to it later. In the meantime, let's move on to the second five-year plan. Before the second five-year plan, China faced a classic problem. The United States did not like the country's rapprochement with the USSR, so they actually declared economic isolation to China. The military plan also did not go smoothly. In 1954, the Communists made a forceful attempt to take over Taiwan, and the US even considered using nuclear weapons. As a result, Taiwan lost several islands, and China focused on its development, inspired by the successes of the first five-year plan. A second five-year plan was developed, which logically continued the development of heavy industry and, unlike the previous plan, paid attention to agriculture. However, before the beginning of the five-year plan in 1958, China refused to use the Soviet experience, and Mao made a mistake that claimed tens of millions of lives. He hastened to announce an unusual five-year plan known as the Great Leap Forward. The Communists were confident that they could reach and catch up with the Western countries in the shortest possible time, not on the basis of professionalism, but relying on the enthusiasm of the people. Nikita Khrushchev promised to catch up and overtake America, and Mao, in order to keep up, challenged Great Britain. However, there was not enough production capacity. Despite the presence of 700,000 artisanal blast furnaces, high-quality steel production was not achieved. And the worst thing was that unprepared and tired peasants were attracted to the industry. They also had to deal with steel smelting. In addition, the war with sparrows began, which we talked about in a separate video. In short, after killing 2 billion birds, the Chinese faced an unbridled breeding army of insects, and together with the peasants who were dragged from the fields, this led to a terrible famine. According to the archives of the Communist Party, between 1958 and 1960, about 45 million peasants died of starvation. In general, the 5-year plan, to put it mildly, failed. A third of GDP was lost, a huge amount of the population. The only thing that saved China from disaster was that, albeit belatedly, they abandoned the Great Leap Forward. Later, Mao even publicly admitted his mistakes, but this did little to help the country. China remained 90% agrarian and continued to fight sparrows for several years. Therefore, the third 5-year plan approached cautiously, and it was only started in 1966. In parallel with the Cultural Revolution, the government finally remembered agriculture and reduced its appetite for economic growth. More important, however, was what happened in the background. There, the final break in relations with the USSR was unfolding. Previously, despite differences, the communist countries opposed capitalism as a united front. The USSR and the PRC supported each other in Korea, Vietnam, and other proxy conflicts. However, the course of the USSR towards peaceful coexistence with capitalism led to a split in relations. Oil was added to the fire by the Sino-Indian conflict, where the Soviets refused to support the PRC. In 1969, the USSR and China found themselves on the brink of war, having entered into an armed confrontation on Damansky Island. This case was an example of historical irony, since the split, which began because of the desire of the USSR to coexist peacefully with the United States, led to a rapprochement between China and the United States. It was from this moment that the economic miracle began. However, we would like to draw attention to another aspect. What was the position of China before the introduction of the open door policy in 1978? China's per capita GDP was less than $200 a year, 50 times less than the US. If we translate these figures into modern money, then the level was comparable to Uganda, Somalia, or Afghanistan. At the same time, China's population has already surpassed 1 billion people, and about 90% of population, according to simple economic indicators, continue to live in extreme poverty, surviving not from paycheck to paycheck, but from rain to sunny day. Don't forget the example of 100% wealth growth. If at the beginning you had only $1 in your pocket, then China was an extremely poor country with a primitive economy by world standards. However, on December 15, 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter announced the restoration of diplomatic relations with China. This was preceded by diplomatic efforts such as ping-pong diplomacy, Taiwan's exclusion from the UN, and a lot of behind-the-scenes intrigue and clandestine meetings. Since then, the conflicting parties have become partners. Many consider this date to be the beginning of the economic miracle, and the numbers are truly impressive. The average annual growth of the economy was in double digits, and in 1984 it reached 15%. Usually, without going into details, people simply claim that the US came to China for cheap labor and raised the country from ruins. However, in fact, the devil is in the details, and the actions of the Chinese government itself played a decisive role. Deng Xiaoping reduced the role of the state in the economy and allowed direct controlled sectors to account for nearly 90% of output. His successors relaxed policy and opened up the market to Western investors, who took advantage of a labor force willing to work for pennies and had few rights organizations and labor regulators. Entire factories in the U.S. were dismantled and moved to China. A striking example is the company Bolgan. In chemistry, there is such a term as rare earth elements. These are 17 elements of the periodic table with unpopular names. As usual, mentioning 3 scandium and other rare earth elements, people usually emphasize their importance for the modern world with its gadgets and green energy. However, the extraction of these metals is often associated with environmental problems. In its desire to become a leader, China played a decisive role, and almost all the factories of the Bolgan Corporation were created according to Japanese or American drawings. There are even rumors that the plant was taken out of California to the last bolt and installed at the largest Bayan Oba field in northern China. As a result, China provided up to 97% of the world's consumption of rare earth elements. This was possible due to cheap labor and little regulation of working conditions, as well as due to the neglect of environmental aspects. There is no doubt that this is an economic miracle, but do not forget about our $1 rule. What happened in China from the 1980s to 2000 is not a miracle, but rather an example of an economy that is catching up. China lagged behind the developed countries so much that any improvement in economic performance on paper led to a significant increase in GDP. However, the real frenetic growth began in 2000 when China joined Hong Kong and joined the World Trade Organization. Hong Kong has become a major financial center and attracted significant investment. Despite the fact that the total share of American investments was only 8%, 70% of the investments came through Hong Kong and from ethnic Chinese. The growth of exports and the quality of Chinese goods, as well as the standard of living of the population, was associated with this period. China's growth and success, which has been hailed as an economic miracle, has also been influenced by other factors. The real world does not always correspond to idealized ideas, and often it is more pragmatic. Corporations did not go to China for noble reasons, but in search of cheap labor and the possibility of exploiting workers without proper regulation. By going to China, they paid workers much less than in their own countries and avoided responsibility for working conditions. Many changes have taken place over time, and in 2020, China declared victory over poverty. According to experts, 20 years earlier, the poorest segments of the population began to earn 65% more. However, the problem of stratification and inequality still exists, and the number of billionaires continues to grow. Now a new trade war is brewing, and corporations are looking for countries where they can pay workers even less than in China. For example, Apple has already opened several factories in India, and perhaps this country will face a similar fate that befell China in its time. Thus, China's history from the 1980s to the present has been one of economic change, including attracting investment through Hong Kong and joining the World Trade Organization. China has made significant progress, but the reality of its economic growth has proven to be more complex and controversial than just an economic miracle.